This week on the agenda, deadlock in France. What does the result of Emmanuel Macron's snap election mean for France at home and abroad? It wasn't the swing to the far right many had expected, but President Emmanuel Macron's decision to call a snap election in the wake of the European poll in June doesn't appear to have done his centrist Ensemble group much good. Unexpectedly, it was the left-leaning New Popular Front that took the most seats, but not enough for an outright majority. So what does this mean for the future of France, both at home and on the global stage? With me now are Renaud Foucart, Senior Lecturer in Economics at Lancaster University, Jacques Reland, Senior Research Fellow at the Global Policy Institute, and Nabila Ramdani, French-Algerian journalist and author of Fixing France, How to Repair a Broken Republic. Thank you all of you for coming on the agenda. Now, Renaud, I'll start with you, because what a result. France will not now have a far-right government after all. I mean, one front-page headline and the morning after the vote read, "Phew." So what's your take on this result?
Well, I think it's largely a moment of clarification in France. After many years of flirting with the far right and sort of expecting the ineluctability of a far-right government, in between the two rounds of elections, so France has a two-round election system. In the first round, people largely voted for the far right, but in the second round, something that hadn't happened in a long time happened. It just, with a few exceptions, both the center and the left decided to make it a referendum for or against the far right. There was every single time one candidate against the far right. And the French electorate made their choice. And their choice was not the far right. So they denied a majority, but they also denied even the first or the second place for the far right. So now France has three blocks, roughly of equal size. The bigger is the left, then the center, then the far right. And in this brand new world, with the far right a minority normally out of the game, they will need to find ways to govern and to show the French that they were right to choose to kick the far right out.
Jacques, I wonder if you agree with that analysis, if you think it was just a little flirtation with the right. What's your take?
No, I agree totally with Renaud. I think one thing that was made clear last Sunday is that the French are attached to the principles of the Republic. And the campaign showed clearly that the National Front or National Rally, who often had the right diagnosis on the situation, did not have the remedies, did not have the answer. And that the answers they had were totally contrary to the Republican principles, to the motto of the French Republic, liberté, égalité, fraternité. The campaign was short and snappy, but in that time it allowed us to see that their program was very divisive, that they wanted to discriminate, that they considered that all citizens were not equal in France, which is anathema to the people. And that's why I was so pleased with the reaction of the French people. It's a great sigh of relief. And it's a sign also that at the same time, the National Front, in my opinion, not everyone shares it, but has been badly damaged by that, because when the campaign allowed us to look into their program, when the French, Macron, what basically Macron had asked is for the French to put their money where their mouth is. They vented their spleen during European election. They still showed a strong support for the ideas in the first round, but in the evening of the first round, they said, hang on, are we going to entrust the future of France to that bunch? They're incompetent. Their economic program doesn't seem to be right at all. They change every day their measures. And on top of that, their list of candidates, about 100 candidates, had very dubious records. One of them was not even able to deal for himself with his financial affairs. He was under tutelage and was going to stood as an MP. So it showed that the amateurism and the National Front, and I think it will be, if Marine Le Pen thinks she can benefit in 2027 from that good showing of the first round, I think the second round showed that they've hit a glass ceiling.
We'll talk about that potential glass ceiling and the presidential race in France a little bit later on. But Nabila, I want to get your take on the results because, you know, France has voted 3 times just in the last few weeks. You know, the European Parliament, which the National Rally, the far right, won. The first round of these elections, whereas we've been talking about, the National Rally was way ahead. And then in the second round, where suddenly the far left jumped into the lead. We're talking unlikely alliances, tactical voting. Talk us through what happened.
Yes, I think this result is basically the outcome of several factors, not least of all because the left formed a broad alliance in between the two so as to keep the far right out of power. They got their act together, if I may put it that way, and allied several groupings that were not necessarily tuned to each other before. So they created that new popular front with the explicit aim of keeping the far right out of power, and that included a coalition of the France Unbowed, the party of Jean-Luc Mélenchon, but also the Greens, the Socialists, the Communists, and different smaller groupings on the left. And there was also the element of tactical voting between the 2 rounds, with an unlikely ideological ally, which is the centrist coalition of Emmanuel Macron, of President Macron, Ensemble altogether, the Renaissance group, which is in itself a creation to block the far right from getting to power. And it has to be said that Emmanuel Macron has shown that he's willing to deal with anybody, including working with the Popular Front, as the new Popular Front had been renamed in between the 2 rounds, and not working with allies of the far right in an effort to keep the far right out of power. But there I say there's also an element of what is called in France the Republican Front, which usually the French voters resort to when they want anybody but the far right. This happened in 2002 to keep Marine Le Pen's father, Jean-Marie Le Pen, out of power when he came second in the when he joined the second round of the presidential election against Chirac. He was firmly kept out of power thanks to that Republican Front. So there was an element of voters supporting the far right. Some 13 million of people voted for them in the first round to effectively let off steam, show their anti-establishment, anti-government sentiment. But when the second round came, their consciences kicked in, and they thought that perhaps France, which is associated as, you know, it's a country of it's the birthplace of human rights and indeed enlightenment, wasn't necessarily the best place to elect the first far-right government since the Second World War, one that collaborated with the Nazi Germany.
All 3 of you then breathing a huge sigh of relief at this result. You know, major win for the left, but there's a catch, isn't there, Renaud? Because they didn't have enough for a majority, and Parliament is likely to be divided. So I wonder how uncertain you think that the shape of France's political future is going to be.
I think it is at the moment completely uncertain, and the answer to Jacques' optimism about the future of the National Rally will really depend on how this divided parliament will work in the current year. So Emmanuel Macron cannot dissolve the parliament anymore for 1 year. So they have 1 year to find ways to work without a majority, without even anyone close to a majority. So this is what happens everywhere in Europe. But in France, people are really not used to that. France has a tradition of having a single party in charge with a lot of power. And we've seen that with the previous Macron government, who didn't have a majority, the idea that sometimes you can use executive order, the 49.3, and say, we want to pass that law, else the government fails. So this time, I think it's almost impossible to do that. So either you will have to have a minority left government, who then will have to be patient about some of the reform, because it's unlikely that they can pass anything major about that, or you would have to have some kind of technocratic or centrist government, which then will be, I think, a bit dangerous for France, because it would again pitch the establishments against the far right for the next election. So I think showing that you can work in that environment and showing French people that there is a choice, a clear choice between left and right, and that it's not just democratic parties versus the far right will be a key in order to get that glass ceiling that we've talked about and the fact that the Rassemblement National is not strengthened before the next presidential election.
Nabila, what do you make of Macron's refusing the resignation of Prime Minister Gabriel Attal?
Well, I think it means that Macron is in a lot of trouble, frankly. I think he's back to being a lame duck president without a parliamentary majority. Remember, he called the parliamentary elections to create stability in France and, of course, to expose the far-right National Rally as not being as popular as they think they are. He certainly succeeded in the latter aim, but not in the former, because there is even more instability now, because nobody has a majority in the National Assembly. And this means that everybody is demanding a stake in power, not least of all the New Popular Front, an alliance of parties which was especially set up to keep the National Rally out of power. And yes, they have a lot of extreme left members. There are communists and Greens who reject capitalism, but generally they are very divided, so I can't see them contributing to a stable government. And I don't think Macron wanting Gabriel Attal back is very surprising. Macron is notorious for selecting puppet prime ministers to carry out his instructions effectively. And with the greatest respect to Mr. Attal, he has always been a Macron yes man. Attal was duty-bound to resign as prime minister, failing to win a majority for the Renaissance Party in the National Assembly. But there is nothing to stop him coming back to the job in the new parliament. And again, Macron is desperate for some stability, and reappointing his favorite prime minister would be an obvious way of restoring some stability. So I can't see Attal objecting to that.
Jacques, I wonder if you agree with that. I mean, if Macron stays the course, what's it going to mean for his role on the international stage? How diminished might it be?
Now, I would like to come back to what Nabila said, because I don't agree with many of the points she made, especially on the role of Attal. Attal is no longer the yes man of Macron. If one came out of the campaign there with an enhanced status, and everyone agrees about it, is Gabriel Attal. He did a tremendous work on the field. He did not want he disapproved completely of the dissolution of the parliament. He was not at all pleased about that, but he did the job. He tried to limit the damage, and he's done beyond expectations, because let's not forget that the Ensemble, the Macronian MPs, gathered 168 seats, which is only 14 short of what the far left did. Therefore, they would come third. It's the National Front who came third. So Attal did very well. But this situation today is very interesting and suits Attal too. It's what probably at a momentous time, at a crossroads. There's the Fifth Republic, when the president and parliament are the same political color, the president is all-powerful. When the president is associated with an opposition who have the majority, the president loses a lot of its powers, and the prime minister is actually the real head of government, as the constitution stipulates. But today we're in an unprecedented situation. We have a president with an opposition. He has no party the opposition has no majority. And no party is able to appoint a prime minister. The role of the president is to appoint a prime minister, but who will he appoint? Obviously, it was always known that he would have to carry out with Attal, the running government, to carry out current business, and also to be present during the Olympic Games, to take care of business during that. In the meanwhile, the role of the parties is to find someone who could be appointed as a potential prime minister, and that will require negotiations between all these different parties.
Let's pause there for a moment, but do stay with us, as still to come here on the agenda, how might a hung parliament in France affect relations with the EU and with China?
We are all connected. Across borders, across continents, connected by ideas, a shared humanity. Stay connected.
Welcome back to The Agenda. And let's continue our discussion now on the perhaps rather confusing results of Emmanuel Macron's snap election in France. Still with me, Renaud Foucart, Senior Lecturer in Economics at Lancaster University, Jacques Reland, Senior Research Fellow at the Global Policy Institute, and Nabila Ramdani, French-Algerian journalist and author of Fixing France, How to Repair a Broken Republic. Renaud, let's talk about the economy. Let's get stuck into some of the policy. The cost of living crisis, economic inequality. These were big themes for voters. How can a new coalition, whichever form that takes, make a difference?
There were huge themes, and both on the far left and on the far right, there have been outcries about France being in the dire state of inequality and not doing enough to protect poor people. So while there is certainly inequality problems in France, France actually during the energy crisis was protecting its citizens much more than anyone else in Europe. The price of electricity, the price of gas have been capped for households at very low level. I mean, compared to England, compared to Germany, this was something very protective. Now about the economy of France, France has at the moment a clear problem of deficit. France is on the trajectory of having the debt, the interest on the debt being the first spending of the states if you don't do anything. So at the same time, you had this boring centrist Macron coalition that was being attacked both on left and right, but there was no discussion of the trade-off. So one of the things that the left would like to do, for instance, is come back on the pension reform, which is absolutely fine as a policy, but has a very big cost. So how do you find money for that? How do you discuss seriously about how much do we want to invest in schools? How much do we want to invest in the energy transition? Is it worth it coming back on some of the more pro-supply reform, labor market supply reform that Macron did? All those things have to be discussed seriously. And to be able to discuss that seriously, you need to have an actual debate between a left and a right who are willing to talk about government. And for that, I think only time will work. At the moment, everyone is kind of an absolutist, meaning that, as Jacques says, the only thing that can happen at the moment is current affairs, trying to sort of manage French on a day-to-day basis. But every day you do that, the clock is ticking, the interest rate on the debt increase. Those things were done, this debt has increased everywhere in Europe, of course, during COVID, during the energy crisis. But now, at some point, there need to be a discussion about choices, about trade-offs, and no one at the moment in France is ready to have the discussion.
Well, in terms of those choices and trade-offs, I'm wondering what all of this is going to mean for France's relationship with the EU. I mean, Nabila, the National Rally made its mark, of course, with their scorn for the European Union. They didn't triumph. So is it business as usual?
Well, to be honest, I don't think that France's status as a founding father of the European project has been dented by what is going on domestically. Macron is one of the most pro-EU leaders in recent French history. Remember, he wanted the EU flag at his investiture back in 2017, along with the French tricolour, for example. And I also think that he will be eyeing a big EU job when he's forced to step down as French president in 2027 after serving the maximum 2 terms allowed as French president. And in which case, I think that the rest of the EU can be pretty happy that Macron is still in power and that the National Rally isn't.
Is that how you see relations with the EU going forward, Jacques?
I think the relations with the EU are quite good. If there's, when we're talking about a government of coalition, there is one field in which a coalition is possible because they all share the same ideas, is European and international policy. The Macronians agree with the socialists, Juliet Mann, with the Greens on the need for Europe, with some of the Republicans on the need to back Ukraine, on foreign policy, and all the big stakes of today's policy. There's an agreement among, I would say, you take the three parties, Socialist Party, the Greens, the Republicans, and the Ensemble, a wide majority backing the support for EU. The only opposition to the foreign policy comes from Mélenchon and the National Rally.
I am still interested to think about how France's role might change on the international stage or not. I mean, Renaud, Macron really championed Ukraine and things like climate action. Can we expect those issues to remain priorities, do you think, in this French administration? Or do you think they might now slip as domestic issues take over?
I think the French institutions are such that the president is in charge of representing France in the international stage. So, of course, there was a risk. If there was a Rassemblement National government, there could have been a chance because they would have to swap, to discuss their different roles. So I think we've noticed that maybe the most significant thing that happened since the election is that one day after the second round, the Rassemblement National joined the pro-Russian group created by Viktor Orban in the European Parliament. So if France had a prime minister that was willing to sit down in the same group as Viktor Orban, the position of France on those issues would have been in trouble. But no, Macron, as Nabila and Jacques have said, had a very strong position in Europe and has been championing for a long time what he called strategic autonomy. So the idea that Europe should not be dependent on any other big bloc. So in the role of France and of Europe in the world, I think this is something that is not changing at the moment during this election. And the role of France will continue to be to try to find a balance between a very large trading bloc, which is the United States, another very large trading bloc, which is China, and protecting the defense of Ukraine from the Russian invasion. So depending on how the situation evolves on the ground, they might be moving in one direction or on the other, but the instinct of Macron is still to try to reindustrialize Europe and to avoid being too dependent on one bloc while preserving the integrity of the continent and the defense of Europe.
In 2024, we're marking 60 years of diplomatic relations between France and China. So I wonder, Jacques, what you think about France's relationship with China now and how that may or may not change?
I don't think it will affect France's relationship with China. France's relationship with China has been to try to avoid conflict. There are problems. We know we can get into the trade discussions. We know that the problem for France's relationship with China is more France wants to establish the French relationship within the framework of the EU. And that's where the problem is. Sometimes the two big countries in the EU haven't got the same views over their their trade relationship with China. See, the Germans are far more dependent on trade with China than the French are. But on the geopolitical issues, the Americans have a tendency to want to widen the remit of NATO and push NATO towards the East Pacific, the South Pacific, with countries like Japan, Korea, and so on, which could be part of the deal. And France is totally opposed to that. I think wants NATO to remain purely a North Atlantic cooperation, defense cooperation unit.
We've been mentioning this throughout the conversation, the presidential elections in 2027. So let's look ahead to those, Nabila. How, with all of this going on, how do you see that playing out?
Well, I think one thing is certain is that it will focus minds. It will raise the question, not least of all, of these very divisive parliamentary elections that, how do the French want to be governed? What kind of government do they want? And do they want a far-right president? That will be the main question for the forthcoming elections. And it has to be said that the far-right vote share has increased massively and so has the vote seats for the National Rally. They had 7 members of parliament in 2017 at the last presidential elections. It rose to 89 seats by 2022 and over 140 seats this time around. But this campaign has also been an opportunity to see how the failings of the National Rally and to expose that it remains a party that is steeped in the most unsavory values, if I may call them that, of anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and other forms of racism. The rise of the far right has certainly been brewing for years. France is an ex-colonial power, and indeed one that had collaborated with Nazi Germany. So there has always been a sizable section of the country that is extremely reactionary, not to say racist. And since decolonization in the 1960s, there has always been a lot of nostalgia for the old empire. And so you throw in to that resentment at the Paris establishment, at a clique that is obsessed with looking after the super rich who run France's very successful multinationals, and millions of French people feel that they are being left behind economically and indeed socially. And these are the ones who are increasingly voting for the extremes. It's a very French form of nihilism, dare I say. But the National Rally has also been exposed during this campaign as incompetent, not just on their economic policies, but also their social policies. For example, their proposal to raise the VAT, to drop the VAT from 20% to 5.5%, or indeed their ideas on how to vote a budget, their proposals on barring dual nationals from holding public sector jobs, banning the hijab on the streets, or indeed putting forward a national preference, which amounts to sheer racism. All of these measures have been deemed unconstitutional by the Constitutional Council. So there's a problem there. Yeah. And you add to that, dare I say, Marine Le Pen is currently caught up in massive corruption scandals, not just for allegedly embezzling money from the EU, but also illegally funding her presidential campaign in 2022. There are court cases coming up that could see her face up to 10 years in prison and indeed being barred from standing for elected office. So there's a lot to take into account until then.
Renaud, is that how you see the future?
I think one of the things that Nabila pointed to, and that I think has been very important, is the fact that the ideas of the far right, at the moment, there's been a lot of talk about them, including from parties that are not the far right themselves, that give the impression that they are sort of acceptable. So Nabila was talking about the ban of hijab on the street. One of the main things that makes you stand out if you want to be interior minister in France is to talk about security, Islam, secularism, etc. That since at least Nicolas Sarkozy 20 years ago. When those ideas are in the mainstream, and this has also been the case that they've been very much pushed forward by the private media in France, that they've been much more sympathetic to the far right in the recent years, the difference between far right parties and centrist parties start to be less visible. What this election has done is to create this clarification. So candidates from the center have said, we are not the same as the far right. And I think looking forward, looking at the future, we cannot deny that not only has there been a record share of the vote of the far right, but a record number of people voting. Like participation has been very high in this election. So those people have been out, those people have been voting. And they will not disappear simply by having a trial against Marine Le Pen.
Renaud Foucart, Jacques Reland and Nabila Ramdani, thank you all very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
You can watch every episode of The Agenda in full on CGTN Europe's YouTube channel. And for exclusive extra content from me, my guests and the rest of the team, don't forget to check out The Agenda Show on TikTok. Coming up on a future agenda, sporting sustainability, how Paris 2024 is shaping up to be the greenest Olympics ever. But for now, from me, Juliet Mann, and from all the Agenda team here in London, goodbye.